afternoon. Welcome back to the first of this afternoon's panels. The topic of the panel is put thus: looking back to the origins of liberalism, what problems was it intended to solve, and to what extent has it succeeded? We have with us three eminent scholars who will help us explore this question. First, Rita Koganzon comes to us from the University of Virginia, where she is assistant professor of politics and director of the program on constitutionalism and democracy. Dr. Koganzon is the author of Liberal States, Authoritarian Families, Childhood and Education in Early Modern Thought. Next, Nasser Behnegar, professor of political science at Boston College, who is currently working on the study of Locke's liberalism. And then third, Judd Owen comes to us from Emory University, where he is professor of political science, author of Religion and the Demise of Liberal Rationalism, as well as Making Religion Safe for Democracy. Each of our panelists will have 20 minutes. This will be followed by question and answer. Our next panel begins promptly at 3 p.m., so we won't have the luxury enjoyed this morning of extending the time. I'll try and make sure that our panelists stick to the time. And there will be a microphone that will be circulated around the room for questions following our panelists' presentations.
So I've been asked to talk about the problems that liberalism was intended to solve, and I think that most of the problems, that is the big ones, have already been thoroughly considered by minds greater than mine. The religious question, the question of rights and virtue, the question of political economy. So I want instead to talk about a problem, not the problem, that liberalism intended to solve. And it's a problem particularly relevant to us today because after many years of seeming to have been solved, it once again appears unsolved. That's the question of population growth and specifically the birth rate. So liberal states today are faced with this problem of fertility decline and with it the prospect of population decline. Of course, immigration can prop up population for a while, maybe even a long while, but a sub-replacement birth rate is a serious cause for concern, especially for conservatives who think, I would say rightly, that an above-replacement birth rate is a sign of national health, and a sub-replacement one is a worrisome sign of pessimism. Among those who see declining birth rates in liberal regimes as a problem, some also see them as an indictment of liberalism itself. On this view, sub-replacement birth rates are the result of centuries of laws and mores that have eroded the family through individualism, capitalism, feminism, divorce laws, legalization of contraception, and abortion, and pornography, and so on. Indeed, on this view, breaking down the family was one of the implicit aims of liberalism in the first place. Declining fertility is just the late-stage evidence that it has succeeded in this self-defeating purpose. But in the 18th century, in Britain and France, liberal thinkers were also preoccupied with the question of population growth. Some of them, like us, worried that they were living in an age of population decline, and Montesquieu went so far as to assert that Europe had been losing population since the collapse of the Roman Empire, due in part to bad laws that disincentivized marriage and childbearing. Responses to Montesquieu came from every corner, from Hume first, and then the Scots, Smith and Ferguson, from Rousseau, Diderot, and Condorcet. These thinkers disagreed about many things relating to population growth: the desirability of trade, of empire, of slavery, of promoting virtue versus self-interest. They even disagreed about the causes of population growth and decline. But there was rather amazing unity on one point, which is that growth was absolutely to be desired and decline to be dreaded. Indeed, before Malthus, population growth was almost a liberal synecdoche for the health of a regime. So it's at least strange to charge liberalism with being anti-natalist or anti-family when early liberals were so uniformly in favor of population increase. Growth, of course, can come about in a number of ways, not exclusively by encouraging family formation. But if we want to understand what foundational ideas about the family and fertility undergirded 18th and especially 19th century liberal politics, we have to begin in the 17th century state of nature theories that tried to account for the origin of human motivations and institutions. All state of nature theorists give some consideration to the formation of the pre-political family. But Locke dwelled at length on the inclinations, relationships, and obligations that constituted it. And he began with a rather striking claim that in nature, no one intends to have children. In the second treatise, Locke asks, what father of 1,000, when he begets a child, thinks farther than the satisfying of his present appetite? God in his infinite wisdom has put strong desires of copulation into the constitution of men, thereby to continue the race of mankind, which he doth most commonly without the intention, and often against the consent and will of the begetter. So we might doubt whether it's in fact true that no one had sex with the aim of producing children in Locke's time or before it. In fact, we know it's not true. The feudal family was tightly bound up with the law of inheritance, so at least producing an heir was always a compelling incentive to procreate. But absent this elaborate system of entail and primogeniture, which Locke opposed, would that incentive have helped? Without a legal imperative to produce male heirs, the family, that is to say the national family, would look very different. It would be motivated not by the desire to have children, but by the desire for sex. Children would only be the accidental result. Still, even if we don't intend to have children, Locke does say that God placed in men suitable inclinations of tenderness toward our children once they're born, to justify the obligations of care that they would impose on us. Rather than treating undesired children as essentially undesirable, Locke makes them the central concern of their parents' lives. Children didn't ask to be born. It is our selfish adult desire that calls them into being, so they don't by nature owe us very much for this questionable favor, whereas we owe them a great deal. For example, according to Locke, we are not permitted to ever kill or harm our children. We must share authority over them equally with our spouses. We are obligated to educate them. We cannot deny them a share of inheritance sufficient to maintain them. And after all our effort, our formal authority over them simply terminates when they reach the age of majority. And what can we expect in return for these efforts? Locke offers us honor. How much honor? Well, that turns out to depend on the child's own assessment of how good a parent we've been. The honor due from a child, Locke says, places in the parent's perpetual right to respect, reverence, support, and compliance too, more or less, as the father's care, cost, and kindness in his education have been more or less. So honor is like a teaching evaluation, not necessarily designed to favor the recipient. So none of this sounds very favorable for parents. You work very hard for your children, and then you score, or they give you a 3 out of 5 on the parenting evaluation in return. So why bother? But we don't bother on purpose, remember? Instead, we pursue our desires into a mutually agreeable marriage in which we have sex, and children are the natural result. The worry that plagued 17th and 18th century thinkers was that people might choose, under certain unfavorable circumstances, to withhold sex. What they seem not to have anticipated so clearly was that it might become possible to have sex without ever producing any children. So long as sex was reliably productive of children, incentivizing marriage was largely sufficient to promote childbearing. Once desire brings two people together, care for their children gives them a communion of interests that keeps them together, as Locke says, so long as is necessary to the nourishment and support of the young ones, till they are able to shift and provide for themselves. Given, moreover, that active sexual desire tends to result in multiple children, the duration of a marriage has to be extended to cover the support of all of them, which will take most adults well into their 50s or 60s. But nature alone does not legislate marital permanence. Locke says, though these are ties upon mankind, which make the conjugal bond more firm and lasting in man than other species of animals, yet it would give one reason to inquire why this compact, where procreation and education are secured, and inheritance taken care for, may not be made determinable, either by consent or at a certain time or upon certain conditions. There being no necessity in the nature of the thing, nor to the ends of it, that it should always be for life. I mean, to such as are under no restraint of any positive law, which ordains all such contracts to be perpetual. So, marriage in nature need not be permanent. So all of this seems a little contingent. In our natural state, we marry from sexual desire. We stay married only long enough to raise our unintended children to independence, and once we've done our duty to them, they abandon us, and our marriage itself dissolves. Locke doesn't really dress this up in any sentimental language. Although he speaks of natural tenderness between family members at times, his description is still quite cold. None of this sounds like an obvious inducement for family formation. But maybe it is. Because at bottom, what holds the Lockean family together by nature is not property inheritance, coercion, fear, religious obligation, or social hierarchy, but love. Marriage is a free choice, mutually desirable for both parties. According to the law of nature, any two people, high-born or low, rich or poor, can marry if they want, which is to say, if they love each other. Love results in children, and since there is no entail or primogeniture in nature, children are not strategic assets to be bartered, but the common interest of parents and equal claimants on parental love. Parents must aggressively demonstrate their love to their children, since it's only the child's perception of such love that validates it. The only way to secure a child's loyalty into the future is to persuade him that you do good for him by his standards. The only way to secure your spouse's continued loyalty is to demonstrate that they're better off with you than with someone else. Love becomes the glue of the Lockean family. That's why he permits divorce. If the family is to be a free choice, it has to admit of being unmade by choice. Locke's is a very accessible conception of the family. It opens it equally to almost everyone. It breaks the feudal connection between family and the state by encouraging equal division of property among all children. Property is consequently both more abundant for young people embarking on marriage and also, strictly speaking, unnecessary as a prerequisite for it. Locke's aim was to transform the family so that it aligned with what he took to be a universal desire, sexual attraction, with childbirth. It is in response to your desire for sex that you marry and have children. This is now so obvious to us that it's hard to imagine why it should have to be made explicit. But in fact, it doesn't have to be this way. Marriage could be the institution through which you dutifully pass on property to legitimate heirs, or you fulfill a formal religious requirement, while love might be a passion you indulge in with people who are expressly not your spouse. This is what chivalric love was in the late Middle Ages, and it's what the characters in Boccaccio's Decameron and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales were up to. This is also the behavior of the rich that Montesquieu complains about in French society in the 18th century. To stuff love into marriage and to make us want to have sex with our own spouses instead of other people's, and then to get us to want to participate actively in the rearing of the resulting children, that's Locke's purpose. It wasn't that no one in Europe had ever had a love marriage before or paid any attention to their children, but this is not mainly what marriage, especially among the nobility, was for in the early modern period. In pre-liberal Europe, you could dally with nuns and priests and other people's spouses, but you couldn't have children with them. Such illegitimate children didn't, so to speak, count. But if those adulterous energies could be channeled back into marriage, then you'd owe all your children a decent upbringing, and they would all count and be counted on. Locke was betting that this formulation would make marriage much more attractive, and as a result, more fecund. But not much more fecund, because Locke required both substantial and equal child-rearing attention for each child, and the logic of this argument does not favor very large families in the absence of sufficient resources for their care. The Lockean family unites inclination with obligation, and is, in the end, a strategy for population growth. But it's also, importantly, a strategy for resource growth to stabilize population growth. These arguments are echoed in Uzbek's letters on population growth in Montesquieu's Persian letters. To reverse the depopulation of Europe, Uzbek proposes to break down every impediment to fruitful marriage for the average person. Polygamy, celibacy, divorce prohibitions, the aristocratic monopoly on land, overbearing rulers, and even the excessive otherworldliness of Christianity. His aims are the same as Locke's: channel love into marriage, make marriage accessible to everyone, open productive work to all, moderate the government and religion, watch your population grow. But again, not too fast. He writes in The Spirit of the Laws, men who have absolutely nothing, such as beggars, have many children. It costs the father nothing to give his art to his offspring, who even in their infancy are the instruments of this art. For Montesquieu, as well as for Locke, fertility alone would be a source of instability if it was not attached to growing productivity, to the encouragement of arts more prosperous than beggary. All the incentives had to converge, to love as well as to work to maintain stability. But this is too naive. Everyone knows that love is a volatile and short-lived passion. It's highly motivating while it lasts, but once it's gone, it either ceases to motivate, or worse even, it repulses. This is not a promising foundation for a long-lasting union. Locke doesn't even call it love, but simply desire. So it's not Locke, but Rousseau who addresses that difficulty. In the Emile, he infuses Locke's cold account of coupling with the tempting rhetoric of what we would today call romance. He models an explicit education for marriage that prepares us to be, more importantly, to remain desirable to our spouses. Sophie and Emile are brought up for one another. Rousseau even demands of men and women that they exaggerate their natural sex differences to make them more dependent on one another so that they will complement and complete each other more effectively and consequently want to remain together. But Rousseau is sober about the fragility of love. He says, whatever precautions one may take, enjoyment wears out pleasures, and love is worn out before all others. But when love has lasted a long time, a sweet habit fills the void, leaves behind, and a transport of mutual confidence exceeds the transports of passion. This is what he consoles Sophie with. Children form a relationship between those who have given them life that is no less sweet and is often stronger than love itself. When you stop being Emile's beloved, you will be his wife and his friend. You will be the mother of his children. This is companionate marriage, or bourgeois sentimental family, if you prefer. But now I'm telling you nothing that you didn't already know from popular sociology. Did this hope for a convergence between love and duty in the family work? Well, between the time of Locke's writings and the cooling of liberal enthusiasm for population growth with the publication of Malthus's essay in 1798, the population of Western Europe increased almost 60%. But this happened at the same time as the marriage age for both sexes went up, the marriage rate went down, and the number of children per woman dropped. By the end of the 19th century, Europe was both more populous and more prosperous, but not necessarily because everyone had paired off into families grounded in principles of love and free choice, though the vast majority at that point were married. So did liberalism solve the birth rate problem? This is why it's important to see the family, I think, not as the liberal problem, but a liberal problem. In transforming the family, liberalism accommodated it to the larger goals of prosperity, liberty, and the relief of man's estate. When you must invest substantial effort into raising and educating every child, it doesn't make as much sense to have 15 of them. Perhaps even more crucially, when the child mortality rate is reduced from 50% in 1700 to 5% by 1950, 15 children make even less sense. Liberals had tied growth to stability. A populous nation of beggars was as undesirable as the pre-liberal depopulation of landed aristocrats. We can see some of the benefits of the liberal transformation of the family more clearly when we look at how modernization has proceeded in non-liberal regimes, which resorted in the 20th century to programs of occasional mass murder to keep populations in check. For example, the artificial famine in the Soviet Union or coercive birth control in China. Indeed, China's one-child policy was a response to a modern Malthusian panic that afflicted liberal states as well in the 1970s, sparked by arguments like Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, which predicted that the global population would outstrip food production within 20 years. But where the US and Europe addressed these fears by redoubling efforts to increase food production while leaving family decisions to individuals, China decided to make the family decisions for them. Today, both liberal and illiberal regimes are at below replacement fertility. Russia, China, Iran, even most of the Gulf states included. Wherever the standard of living goes up, fertility goes down. Liberalism certainly sought this outcome to a point, but not to this point. Well, where are the exceptions? Today, at least in developed countries, they're in religious communities. But only those where religiosity is by choice, since where states compel religious practice, as in many Muslim countries today, fertility is also low and declining. In this respect, it's still liberalism that has a slight edge. It's more tolerant and pluralistic, so that the Amish and the Orthodox Jews and the Mormons and the Catholics can cultivate orthogonal ways of life in the US in a way that's not as workable in China or Iran or Qatar. It is, of course, possible for liberal states to become more restrictive, or even to dissolve these communities with the sheer pull of their secular temptations. But is that easier than it is for non-liberal regimes to build them from scratch? The same passions unleashed by liberal modernity, individualism, sexual desire, or contractual view of marriage, have now taken almost everywhere, including in non-liberal regimes. But liberalism was the regime that sort of first contained them, and it remains the most flexible in regard to them. It can't force people to marry and have children, but it also can't prevent them. Non-liberal regimes have up to now been pretty good at prevention, but it remains to be seen whether they can succeed in enforcement. Most non-liberal policies to increase birth rates in the past decade have actually been liberal in their substance. That is, they've tried to incentivize having children, usually financially, not to coerce it. But non-liberal states do have some more coercive tools at their disposal. They could prohibit contraception, for example. They could penalize unmarried or childless adults, like the Spartans did. But the limit that no regime can pass beyond remains the same one that Montesquieu identified in the 18th century. You can't breed people like you can breed cattle. Unless you develop something like Truman Firestone's technology of artificial wombs, you can't at any scale make babies by force. Procreation always to some degree requires an incentive, and so remains to some degree a choice. According to Montesquieu, the coerced family, in the seraglio or under European religious inheritance constraints, was itself the cause of population decline. Misery and tyranny were barren. Freedom could be fecund. Do the critics of liberalism reject this wager, or is the family that even the critics want still ultimately the liberal family, only in greater numbers? In linking love to marriage and centering child rearing, liberals hope to make the family a stable and accessible source of happiness in a competitive society. But this would only work if it was a choice. It's of course true that this choice can be a source of unhappiness too. Even Rousseau saw the fragility of love marriage. But so long as the critics of liberalism maintain an ideal of the family based on love and choice, they really seem to still be arguing in the terms of Tocqueville's liberalism. That is, they're arguing for ways to divert liberal democracy's tendency to take its principles to their logical extremes, and for ways to buttress counter-liberal institutions within liberalism, rather than for an alternative to those principles and institutions.
So, what were the problems that liberalism originally tried to solve, and to what extent did it succeed? I would approach these questions somewhat indirectly by first giving a very brief sketch of the world in which John Locke found himself. In 1660, Locke, who was then in his late 20s, wrote that there is no one that can have a greater respect and veneration for authority than I. I no sooner perceived myself in the world, but I found myself in a storm, which had lasted almost hitherto. The storm in question are the English civil wars that erupted within days of Locke's 10th birthday, and the unstable commonwealth that succeeded those wars. We all have memories from our high school days. I'm sure one of Locke's memories was when he was 16 years old, and he was a student at Westminster School, and the head of the school brought all the scholars together to pray for Charles I, whose head was about to be detached in 2 hours. So that so these are the storms that Locke has in mind. Some 20 or 30 years later, after he wrote this statement, Locke became a revolutionary, fighting against the despotic aims of Charles II and James II, and defending the right of the people to strike violently at a government that had declared through its actions to have tyrannical aspirations. It is telling that Locke never describes his right as the right of rebellion. It is such misguided governments that are the true rebels, those who return us to the state of war. Locke's doctrine only makes rebellion less likely because it warns rulers who might otherwise be tempted not to overstep their bounds. What seems to be an argument in favor of rebellion is actually an argument in favor of good order. This rare combination of the love of order and freedom is a characteristic feature of the liberalism that is informed by Lockean political philosophies. Revolutionaries generally complain about the oppressive laws of the established government, but the first complaint of the authors of the American Declaration of Independence is the refusal of the English king to give his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for public good. It is then not surprising that these revolutionaries so easily transitioned into outstanding statesmen of the new republic. Ordinarily, you would think that the kind of person that it would take to destroy a government would be a different kind of person to build the government. But the American statesmen they could do both because they were different types. Now, the twin concerns for order and freedom inform the very foundation of Locke's political theory, and not just his personality. Locke's doctrine of the state of nature is a radicalized and generalized formulation of what Thucydides and Aristotle called stasis, or factional conflict. To be sure, Locke discusses instances of the state of nature that cannot be characterized as factional conflicts. The case of a civilized man marooned in a deserted island with an uncivilized man, or the relation between heads of states. These, however, are mentioned only to defend aspects of his doctrine, that there are laws binding on us outside of civil society, or that the state of nature will never completely disappear. The version of the state of nature. Oh, this doesn't work? Thank you. Okay, the version of the state of nature, which is the seed of his political theory, the state of nature that one has to leave in order to avoid the state of war, is factional conflict. The state of nature leads to confusion and disorder because in punishing one's enemy, one's judgment is distorted by self-love that has a collective dimension to it. As Locke puts it, self-love will make them partial to themselves and their friends. The basic problem that Locke tried to solve is the problem of anarchy or civil war, or the creation of a peaceful relation among groups within a community. It was liberalism's concern for peace that led Carl Schmitt to discern in liberalism a tendency to deny the importance of the distinction between friends and enemies, a tendency which he thought is tantamount to the depoliticization of human life. Whatever merit this criticism may have with regard to the development of liberalism, it obscures an essential aspect of Lockean liberalism. For one may ask, what is Locke's cure to the state of nature? The answer is obvious: civil society, which is another name for political society. Looking at this perspective, one could say that the basic problem that Locke tried to solve is the restoration of politics. I'm aware that this suggestion of mine goes against the current of Lockean reflection for the past 70 years, so some explanation is necessary. And in the first place, I appeal from Carl Schmitt to a higher authority on things political. According to Aristotle, a political community is a self-sufficient society that is governed by its own laws. In Book 3 of Politics, Aristotle recognizes monarchy and tyranny as two kinds of politeia, or regime, or constitution, as the term is usually translated in English. 2 out of the 6 that he mentions. Yet, in Book 5, he contrasts monarchy and tyranny to regimes, indicating they're not kinds of regime. This has perplexed commentators so much that one translator, Conslord, adds in brackets Republican next to regime. This makes the contradiction disappear, but it does so only by obfuscating Aristotle's point, which is absolute kingship and tyranny are not really modes of politics, but of despotism. As he puts it in Book 4, where the laws do not rule, there is no regime. Similarly, Locke criticizes absolute monarchy because it is incompatible with civil or political society. Men cannot, he writes, think themselves in civil society till the legislator was placed in the collective bodies of men, call them Senate, Parliament, or what you please. Although at first Locke maintains that absolute monarchy is a state distinct from the state of nature, he ultimately argues that absolute monarchy is the worst form of the state of nature. Quote, no man in civil society can be exempted from the laws of it. For if any man may do what he thinks fit, and there be no appeal on earth for redress or security against any harm he shall do, I ask whether he be not perfectly still in the state of nature, and so can be no part or member of that civil society. Perhaps because despotism was a much greater danger in early modernity, Locke puts an even greater emphasis on the rule of law than Aristotle does, an emphasis that finds expression in the identification of the legislative power as the fundamental power of the government, and the invention of the notion of executive, an office defined by its duty to execute the laws. According to Aristotle, a political community is one in which the citizens determine their policy and laws by reasoning together. Man is a political animal because he's a rational animal. Now you find this thought, Locke suggests this thought through this funny use of his language. He speaks of both civil society and political society. But on one hand, he means the same thing, but the thought is that a society, a genuine political society is a society of citizens. Or to put it another way, religious government is not civil government. Now this thought, it was directly opposed by a doctrine of the divine rights of kings. A doctrine which was the bulwark of absolute monarchy and supported by many among the clergy. In the two treatises of government, Locke aims his javelin at this doctrine and blows it to smithereens. You might have guessed by javelin, I don't mean the old-fashioned, but the ones that are produced by Raytheon. And in the preface to that work, he makes it clear that he meant to deprive the clergy of their harmful influence on politics. So at last, he writes, all times might not have reason to complain of the drummed ecclesiastic. Although Locke goes further than Aristotle in separating religion and politics, much of this, I think, is in the spirit of Aristotle, who says that priests are absolutely necessary in a political community, but their office is not a political office. Now, despite the affinity between the two thinkers, Locke departs from Aristotle by solving two basic problems that the latter failed to solve. The first concerns the problem of factions. Aristotle enumerates and discusses 11 causes of factional conflict with 85 empirical examples illustrating these causes. The list is comprehensive, except there is no mention of conflict between religious sects. This is not surprising. Although Aristotle was aware of instances of religious fervor leading to unjust or foolish actions, think of the decisions to put to death the generals in the Peloponnesian War who failed to pick up the bodies because of the storm, or the attack on Alcibiades for the suspicion that he may have cut up the penises of the statues of gods. These are things that had terrible political consequences. Nonetheless, Aristotle had no experience of sectarian conflicts, say between Anglicans and Puritans, or Protestants and Catholics. To be sure, two of comments of Aristotle, when put together, can help us understand this problem. I mean his observation that every difference, however small, makes a factional split. And that the greatest factional split is perhaps between virtue and depravity. Swift makes use of the first when he speaks of people having big fights over whether you should open your egg to the bottom or above. But that's I think you have to put the other element into the picture. But these observations, I think, are not sufficient basis for addressing this problem as a practical matter. Locke, on the other hand, addresses the problem of sectarian conflict by sharply distinguishing the ends of commonwealth from that of the church. He does this by having a narrower and a different understanding of civil interest than Aristotle had. According to Aristotle, the city comes to be for the sake of life, but it exists for the sake of the good life, or for the sake of noble action. Since, according to Aristotle, the purpose of the city is peace and not war, the noble actions in question are not those of war but of peacetime. But in a Christian world, there is nothing nobler than the actions of a true Christian. Aristotle's teaching thus has the unintentional tendency of making religious life the purpose of the political community. The second problem that Locke solved is one that Aristotle identified but could not solve. It has to do with the economic basis for politics. One cannot have politics under conditions of extreme poverty, or good politics when there is a large group of poor people arrayed against the rich. According to Aristotle, the problem of faction is ameliorated when there is a large middle class mediating between the poor and the rich. But Aristotle does very little in showing how one can create that large middle class, leaving it essentially to being a matter of chance. If you have one, that's great. Even apart from the problem of faction, Aristotle acknowledges that a political community needs to acquire wealth, even more than a household. But his teaching discourages acquisition of wealth as something unnatural. Aristotle essentially accepts what one may call the natural poverty of human condition. One consequence of this is that he has to stomach the institution of slavery, which he regarded as an unjust institution. But in doing so, he allowed for the existence of an anti-political institution in the household which existed in the political community. Will not the habits of tyranny learned at home have a harmful consequences of political life? Locke's rationalism, on the other hand, encourages domination of nature and transforming natural poverty into a world of plenty. Locke's position allows for the coexistence of civilization with the abolishment of slavery. It also strengthens the ability of a civilized political community to defend itself. He wrote, "That prince who shall be so wise and godlike as by established laws of liberty to secure protection and encouragement to the honest industry of mankind against the oppression of power and narrowness of party will quickly be too hard for his neighbors." Whereas Montesquieu encourages commerce in order to corrupt men's morals so that they become tolerant of others, and Kant in order to create peace among nations, Locke endorses industry in order to establish political self-sufficiency and to build the character of men. While God gave the world to men in common, Locke adds that he gave it to the use of the industrious and rational. In conclusion, it seemed that Locke did succeed in restoring political life by solving the chief obstacles against it. He destroyed tyranny and despotism. He destroyed the doctrine of divine rights of kings. All of us who teach this period notice how much we have to revive this doctrine to make people take it seriously in order to destroy it again. He destroyed the dangerous influence of religion on politics. He destroyed the institution of slavery. He created a world of plenty with a large middle class and a wealthy political order that can defend itself against barbarism. These achievements of Lockean liberalism, many of them are still with us, and I would say today, after February 24, we appreciate them even more because Russia has shown what kind of men are produced by tyranny and the culture of serfdom. But I don't want to end my talk with a panegyric on liberalism. Two concerns and questions I want to address at the end. Looking at January 6th and the riots and lootings of the summer before that, and the endorsement of these events by our political figures, one cannot say that this is a good blend of love of freedom and order. It's similarly looking at legalization of cannabis by many states, one cannot say that those who legalized cannabis, their view was to create rational and industrious people. Certainly there is a work ethic problem. A personal anecdote from just last week. I live in Brookline, and for 4 days we did not receive our mail. And then one of my neighbors earns his living through the mail. And so he complained to the post office, and the manager said, look, people have no work ethic, they just don't show up to work. So there are problems in modern liberal order, but I want to ask the question, just as proposed, maybe so much of our problems have to do with the abandonment of original Lockean liberalism. So that's a question or concern one. The second one goes in the opposite direction. Although Locke did succeed in destroying religious factional conflict, the world that was produced is not free from factions. And you could say we have an altogether new kind of factional conflicts, that is conflicts that David Hume called based by parties based on speculative principles. Different philosophical or ideological positions fighting themselves in society. I think that's, of course, a consequence of the move that was made by Locke. But even that, the question is the opposition to liberalism, is that reasonable or unreasonable? Because this is a question that we will be addressing in the conference. And related to this is the question is that how much of the problem had to do with the original liberalism and how much it had to do with the later liberals? It's you have generals and commanders. The general could be sound, but his officers may not be so sound. So that's those are some of the things I think I hope we could talk about. Not necessarily this panel, because I don't have an answer to them, but maybe others could give answers to them. Thank you.
The question of liberalism's origins, and for this panel, what problems does liberalism originally intend to solve? The question of liberalism's origins always lead to Thomas Hobbes, where its intentions come to sight as somehow both moderate and extreme. As he was a thinker who typically appears sober and hard-headed, to say the least, but also somehow intoxicated by the vision of a future in which reason would guide mankind to an unprecedented happiness, at least as he conceived of happiness. Devin, last night, spoke a bit about Hobbes' controversial position at or near the beginning of liberalism. I myself would go a bit further than Devin did in making the case for Hobbes as a liberal, but the very question calls attention to the fact that liberalism is not immune to its own factionalism. It's a disagreement over what it fundamentally is and for the sake of what it is. I won't rehearse here the case for Hobbes' liberalism, except to say that as powerful as Hobbes believed the Leviathan state must be, its power is necessary with a view to the narrowest of purposes, a revolutionarily limited government for the sake of peace first and foremost, and the ever-expanding commodities of life, of private life, that require peace and will be facilitated by a new science, both political and natural. Beyond that purpose, the Leviathan state has no concerns for our goodness or salvation or anything else, and is therefore tolerant to the greatest degree compatible with peace. Hobbes, I think, was a sort of political progressive, meaning that he believed that the Leviathan state could grow more tolerant as enlightenment with its security and prosperity advanced. Now, Nasser just spoke of liberalism's goal of solving the problem of state of nature, the problem of the state of nature in the case of Locke. I want to go back before the state of nature, so to speak, that is before Hobbes' first articulation of the state of nature, starting with the elements of law, and consider what became his mature doctrine, including the doctrine of the state of nature, in light of his first major published work, his translation of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. He's already come a few times in this conference. I'll get into it in more detail now. Hobbes published his translation in 1629, the same year that the ill-fated Charles I dissolved Parliament for the fourth time and began 11 years of so-called personal rule of Parliament. By the end of the personal rule, Hobbes had completed the first articulation of his mature doctrine in 1640, the year Hobbes fled to England, and 2 years prior to the outbreak of the English Civil War. He seems to have had a keen radar for a deteriorating situation. Two passages in Thucydides' history stand out most to me in light of his mature doctrine. First and most obviously is the account of the civil wars that began in the city of Corcyra and spread from there throughout Greece. While both Hobbes and Thucydides are preoccupied with war, Hobbes' concern with war is almost entirely with civil war, sedition, and the dissolution of government. And so Thucydides' account of the Greek civil wars stands out for this reason. And not coincidentally, that account cannot help but to remind us of Hobbes' foundational doctrine of the state of nature. Corcyra had played a pivotal role in the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, as indeed did factional conflict between the people, demos, the elites, and the Corcyrian colony of Epidamnos. The factional conflict on Epidamnos is in fact the first of the events leading to the outbreak of the broader war, the war that Thucydides says was the greatest the Greeks had ever experienced and more worthy of study than any that had preceded it. He tells us nothing of the domestic politics at that time of Corcyra, which refused, when asked, to intervene in the internal affairs of its former colony. Corcyra at that time was not aligned with either oligarchic Sparta or democratic Athens, and Thucydides leaves us to speculate about whether its neutrality had anything to do with the desire to avoid its own factional conflict internally. In any case, once Corcyra was compelled to take sides with democratic Athens, the new alliance did stir factional conflict, culminating in a brutal civil war between democratic and oligarchic factions, and spread in ever more extreme fashion from there. Thucydides' account of these civil wars is a case study in what I think of as a centrifugal politics, as the dynamic of factional conflict pulls each side further toward extremes in response to one another. The extremes Thucydides describes are less striking in their opposition than in their similarity, that is, both sides suffer the same effects. These extremes include, of course, acts of violence, what he calls extraordinary arts of attacking and outlandish retaliations, but also what he spends far more time describing, a revolution in thought, when, as partisans sought to justify their actions, they, quote, exchanged what they customarily deemed worthy in the words that they attached to deeds. For example, he says, irrational recklessness was fashioned a courageous love of comrades. Provident delay, a pretext for cowardice. Moderation, a cover for unmanliness. Intelligence with respect to everything, idleness in everything. Impulsive anger was considered the share of a true man, and deliberation of security and eloquent pretense for dereliction. Partisans on both sides, Thucydides says, strengthened their trust in one another less through divine law than through sharing in some illegality. Revenge mattered more than not being harmed in the first place. and they enjoyed revenge more in a situation of trust than if they accomplished it openly. Meanwhile, citizens in the middle, either because they had not taken sides or because begrudged on account of their survival, were destroyed by both factions. And this way, he says, every form of viciousness was established in the Hellenic world on account of the civil wars. And the simplicity that the well-born shared in most disappeared because it became ridiculous. This inversion of virtue, in this inversion of virtue, Thucydides' observations remind me of Hobbes' claim that in the state of nature, force and fraud are the cardinal virtues. It's true that for Hobbes, the notion of right and wrong, just and unjust, have no place in the state of nature. Whereas what Thucydides describes in intricate detail is more of a perversion of notions of right and wrong. Still, Hobbes and Thucydides seem to agree that the decent virtues of civilized life are more fragile than we wish to believe, and that, quoting Thucydides, by stripping away daily ease, war is a violent teacher and makes the passions of most men resemble present prayers. War teaches harsh truths about human nature that peace obscures. Hobbes and Thucydides also agree on the destructive role in this degeneration of the desire to rule on the part of the ambitious few, making use of specious rhetorical appeals. The cause of all of this, Thucydides writes, was the desire to rule out of greed and ambition, leading to a love of strife when zealously pitted against one another. For the leading men in the cities, though in speech they seemed to be servants of the common things, they in fact made the common things their prize, and striving by whatever means to win, perpetrated the most horrible outrages and pursued vengeance even farther, without any regard to justice or the common good. Here, however, we arrive at the theme of the panel, and the juncture where Hobbes most obviously and in dramatic fashion, I think, parts company with Thucydides. For Thucydides says of the cruelties unleashed by the civil wars that they are such, quote, as shall always be, so long as human nature is the same, varying only in severity with changing circumstances. In contrast, Hobbes believed, or at least with his mature doctrine he came to believe, that such cruelties need not always come to be. He believed civil war was a solvable problem, not just temporarily or cyclically. A problem ultimately arising not from human nature, but from faulty education. And a problem that could be solved, or at least the foundation of the problem could be laid through a radically new education. In a remarkable statement in the Epistle Dedicatoria to Chive, Hobbes says that by reducing the principles of human actions to a science possessing the clarity of geometry, his innovation in moral philosophy would, quote, disarm ambition and greed, whose power rests on the false opinions of the vulgar about right and wrong. And the human race would enjoy such steadfast peace that, apart from, as would surely arise over land as the multitude of human beings grew on account of this peace. I wasn't anticipating Rita's comments when I was posing this, but they come as special significance in light of Rita's paper. Apart from the conflict that would arise over land as the population grew because of the peace, mankind would never again be seen fighting. This is an extraordinary hope for a philosopher, for a student and admirer of Thucydides to entertain. Now, part of what's extraordinary is what he doesn't say but seems to imply, I think. Does Hobbes mean here to say that not only is the problem of civil war solvable, which itself is an amazing claim, but also, or somehow thereby, war simply? Surely mankind has seen fighting at least as frequently in international wars as in civil wars. Thucydides' history is a study in how to feed one another. And, like also makes use of the relation between nations as an example of the state of nature. Now, what Hobbes thought about the prospect of international war is perhaps impossible to determine, owing to his strangely stubborn silence on the matter. But whatever the case may be, 40 years after his publication of the translation of Thucydides, Hobbes penned the civil wars of his day. Civil wars remain his preoccupation throughout, on the teaching of the moral and political philosophy of Aristotle and the Romans that followed him. As he indicates in Leviathan, the solution requires that the true moral and political science, that is Hobbes's, be put into effect by an enlightened sovereign who would disseminate the essentials of that science from the top down through the universities, where Aristotle's dominance apparently would be replaced by Hobbes's, and from the universities via priests and other mediaries to the common people, thus disarming the greedy and ambitious. Now, to flesh out this education a little bit more than Hobbes does in the passage I just cited, its main features, so far as I can see, are the following. First, a basic education in natural causation, including the wholly natural causes of dreams and visions, with a view to removing superstition and gullibility, including and not especially that of the common people. Second, education in the basic selfishness of human nature, both of our own and that of the vainglorious and ambitious few who contend with one another to lord over the rest, making use of eloquent pretenses of nobility, divine wisdom. Third, frequent reminders of the horrors of the state of nature, with a view to sobering us into obedience to the sovereign power and recognition of the folly of appealing to any higher standard of right and wrong by which to judge the sovereign, on the grounds that such appeals are inherently specious, human nature being what it is, but more importantly, that they tend to lead us back toward the state of war. These are the elements of the popular enlightenment that Hobbes seems to have supposed would lead to what Kant would come to call perpetual peace. And it leads me to the second passage from Thucydides' history that stands out to me in light of Hobbes' mature doctrine, the famous Melian dialogue. The Melians were Spartan colonists who, unlike other islanders, had refused to submit to Athens in the hope of remaining neutral. The Melians grew hostile to Athens after increasing pressure, leading Athenian generals who were exerting the pressure to send envoys to persuade the Melians to submit. The envoys employ what seems to me a quasi-Hobbesian approach to persuading the Melians, appealing to raw power and a blunt statement of the destruction that otherwise awaits. It's a sort of state of nature scenario where justice has no place and reason says that survival and any hope for a decent life requires submission to power. It's a stark and unwelcome alternative, but the Athenians hope a clear and compelling one. The Athenians warn the Melians not to be like the many, the common people, quote, who, when human means of saving themselves are still available, abandon tangible hopes and turn to intangible ones, to prophecy, oracles, and other such things that combine with hope to destroy men. But alas, the Melians do hope in spite of it all. They don't submit. They do not agree that justice has no place, or at least they suppose that if they do not succumb to cowardice and resist with courage, their hope for salvation by the gods, or by their kin, the Spartans, is not rational. Their hope is a moral hope that has a place, even if not especially, in the face of Athens' unjust aggression. Now, the Melians were indeed overwhelmed by the Athenians, who were helped by the betrayal of certain ones of the Melians themselves, closer kin than the Spartans. The Athenians killed the men and enslaved the rest. Does this outcome suggest that the Athenian envoys were wise about the weakness of justice unsupported by power and the folly of Melian hope? Perhaps, but it at least as clearly suggests a failure of the Athenian envoys to understand the power of hope in the human heart. Does Hobbes understand the human heart any better than the Athenian envoys? Did he in fact succeed in reducing the principles of human action to a science with the compelling clarity of geometry? For Aristotle, whom Hobbes detested and would evidently banish from education, for Aristotle, what is seen by the eyes can be too bright, but purely intellectual truths, in contrast to geometric ones, cannot be seen with too much clarity. But knowledge of good and bad, and therefore right and wrong, is not like mathematical knowledge, as Hobbes seemed to assume. Knowledge of the human good, and moreover the difficulties on the path to such knowledge, are for Aristotle of a fundamentally different character from mathematical knowledge. Nor is such knowledge likely material for a popular enlightenment along the lines of ninth grade geometry, which is itself not so easy for many students. Now back in Coursera, it's perfectly reasonable to assume, I think, that Hobbes would have not identified with either of the factions as they spiraled to extremes, but instead with the citizens in the middle who were destroyed by the factions, and with those intelligent and cautious citizens who were destroyed by the lesser minds who went recklessly into action and caught their betters off guard. This is Hobbes the moderate amidst the fanatics. At the same time, however, the extremity of Hobbes's hopes of preventing such atrocities in perpetuity are but one example of a subsequent array of extreme modern hopes that would follow in his wake. Hopes to remake mankind, master chance, master nature, change the world. Extreme hopes with stuff of factions. Now, to be sure, Hobbes resembles Thucydides more than he resembles Aristotle in obvious respects. Aristotle's lengthiest discussion of war that I'm aware of is in the history of animals. It's about war between animals, not in the politics, where war almost hides in the periphery. Nevertheless, Aristotle is closer than Hobbes is to Thucydides, so far as the solubility of the fundamental problems in political life, including the perennial problem of factional conflict, is concerned. Each in his own way is a teacher of the limitations of politics and the causes of those limitations. And each, therefore, has the potential, I think, of moderating extreme hopes for what politics can achieve. And this is related to my final point. I said at the outset that liberalism itself is a contested notion, what it is and what it is for the sake of. And although many of the arguments offered against Hobbes's liberalism fundamentally misunderstand, in my view, Hobbes or liberalism, or both, there is one point where Hobbes's credentials as a liberal are truly questionable. For it seems to me, at least, that there cannot be a liberal education that banishes Aristotle, the philosopher who, so far as I'm aware, was the first to articulate the principles of liberal education. He did so in books 7 and 8 of Politics, where the core of the best regime is education with a view to complete virtue, which means above all with a view to leisure, properly understood. War is for the sake of peace. Occupation is for the sake of leisure, understood as the sort of serious and noble activity that is truly free because it is choice-worthy in itself. As Aristotle says in metaphysics, just as we may say of a human being that he is free when he is for his own sake and not for someone else, so too the pursuit of wisdom is free, since it is done for its own sake. Aristotle's political doctrine to them is directed toward the free activity of the private life. And in this most important respect, he can be said to present a distinct version of liberalism that's in grave danger today and very much worth defending.
We're disposed, Josh Mitchell from Georgetown, we're disposed often when we talk about liberalism to think in terms of ancients and moderns. But, another way to look at this is that liberalism is working itself out within the great crisis of the Reformation. And so I want to ask Rita and Judd something, and then Nasser after that. So are Hobbes and Locke, in your view, anti-Christian or Protestant anti-Catholic? I say this on the following grounds. On marriage, for example, one way of looking at it is Locke is trying to say it's not a sacrament. It's a fiercely anti-Catholic argument. And then so much of his writing, theology, it hinges on the relationship between Adam and Christ, which is a Protestant trope. And then he writes notes and paraphrases on St. Paul's epistles. And then with respect to Hobbes, the several things that you mentioned, natural causes. Well, this is an argument against the Catholic idea of miracles. The centrality, for example, of Moses in part 3. And then the condescension toward Aristotle in both of their cases. So Nasser, I'd like to hear a bit more about that. So is it the case that what is being played out really is Protestants versus Catholics?
Well, Locke is certainly anti-Catholic. I mean, he's sort of overtly anti-Catholic in certain ways. But Protestantism is just beginning at that time. So Protestantism has to work itself out too. So to say that you are an anti-Catholic Protestant is a kind of open-ended statement, right? So in his view on the family, the acceptance of divorce, when Montesquieu, writing later, says that's the distinctly Protestant innovation. I mean, this is later in the 18th century. That's the distinctly Protestant innovation to the European view of marriage, right? So, getting rid of the vows of celibacy, that was a good move on the part of the Protestants. And he says some Protestants have also even accepted divorce, which would be kind of favorable. But it's in progress, so it's hard to say, is he, I mean, he asserts he's a Protestant. What does that mean, though? I think it's still under construction at the time that Locke was writing. The point about his anti-Catholicism, I mean, it's a kind of political anti-Catholicism. But I think that, if you, and I'm not going to be the only one who said this, I mean, there's an entire book trying to sort of link Locke to Aquinas, right? And to say that this is a kind of, that Locke is kind of making an effort to revive Thomistic doctrines in a different context. And, I mean, I think that might be a strategy. But he just tried to make this claim. But I do think that actually on the question of marriage as love and choice, that's not so crazy, right? That if you look at Aquinas on marriage, and for Aquinas, marriage is not a sacrament that has anything to do with the feudal order of property, right? I mean, for the church, that's the case. And so in a certain sense, I mean, this would not, I don't know if this is Locke's conscious intention, but Locke is very concerned about the property relations tied up in feudal marriage and the way that they obstruct marriage. And so the church is not interested in those property relations, right? If those are kind of tacked on by a feudal political order. So if you want to see Lockean or liberal marriage as a kind of reduction of sort of early modern or pre-liberal understanding of marriage back to something simpler or something more flexible and easier to attain, then it's not actually at odds with the Catholic view of marriage. But it is not marriage to the sacrament. It takes out the sacramental character of it. But in terms of the requirements and the conditions and the way that Aquinas discusses the nature of the choice that has to be made, that every choice has to be made freely, the way that you have to continually please your spouse, and things like that, it doesn't seem to be clearly at odds with it. But it's not required by God.
Yeah, it's a good question. As far as Hobbes is concerned, it's difficult for me to discern a clear answer to that. I think we mostly associate Hobbes' anti-Catholicism with Leviathan. That's the book that we read most or most familiar with. That was written at a time of Puritan ascendancy. Behemoth was written much later. He takes aim at the Presbyterians, who I assume means the Puritans mainly. And he has some unfavorable things to say about the prospects of the unrealized prospects of Catholicism for stability, because it's hierarchical, and he likes hierarchy. In answer to your most basic question, I would say I think Hobbes is anti-Christian as he saw Christianity around him, and wanted to radically transform Christianity, but to do so in a non-Christian spirit. So what does that make him anti-Christian? I don't know. It's not quite that simple. So far as the miracles are concerned, I think that it's not simply I think it includes a lot of the superstitions that, you're right, other Protestants complained about vehemently, many Catholic superstitions, holy water, and so forth and so on. But also just inspiration, I think is a really major target for Hobbes. The idea that any one of us individually can have direct line of communication or inspiration from God, which I think was at least as prevalent among Protestants, if not more so, than Catholics at that time. So he's against that.
I would quibble with the suggestion that Locke is anti-Catholic, because being anti-Catholic could mean many different things. In Letter Concerning Toleration, he expresses intolerance toward that aspect of Catholic belief that are incompatible with civil life. So if Catholics obey the Pope over the civil government, that's out. And there are other aspects of religious belief that, like some Catholics and some Protestants would share that he would reject that. But on many basic issues between Catholicism and Protestantism, the meaning of Eucharist and so forth, I think there's perfect toleration in that. But to go back to your question about Aristotle, Locke's debt to Hobbes, I think, is tremendous. But there are also very big differences. And one of the differences is that when you look at Hobbes, he has an open contempt for Aristotle, Aristotelity, right? What is it? As far as I know, in none of Locke's published writing there is a criticism of Aristotle. I think my paper suggests that he's critical of aspects of Aristotle, but he has a different tone. It could be, of course, part of Locke's much greater prudence as a writer, but I think there is also a substantive difference, because one of the things that Hobbes did not like about Aristotle was that his Aristotle was a kind of a republican Aristotle, and that republicanism undermines the civil order, and Locke is very much in favor of that republicanism. So I think there are differences between
I just wanted to press Josh Mitchell's question a little further, but put it in a different, maybe somewhat different way. When you're trying to do the comparison and to make the suggestion that Locke and Hobbes thought they were solving problems that the ancients thought couldn't be solved. And central to those problems is factional conflict. Doesn't a huge part of that picture have to be that factional conflict meant something very different in the 17th century? And that the religious faction had become such a different problem in modern times than it was in the ancient world. And therefore, in trying to understand liberalism as a solution to a problem, it's not exactly the same problem that the ancients confronted. It's really, in many respects, a new problem, or it taken on, or if at least the flickers of it were there in the ancient world, it had taken on much more massive proportions in the modern world. You know, certainly after the Reformation, and maybe even in some respects prior to it, because religion had so much changed its character to become a political problem in such a different way. So, and in a way, you guys touched on that a little bit in your remarks, but I was just wondering if you might say more about that dimension, that factional conflict, once it becomes religious conflict, is a different kind of factional conflict.
I would agree with that, although it seems to me, just on the face of it, that even supposing that they had in mind and could succeed and did succeed in solving that new sort of factional conflict, that would still, wouldn't that leave humanity back in the position it was before, closer to the ancient position where the ancients thought that the older factional conflict, I think, was not solvable, whereas Hobbes, at any rate, seems to think that if we can solve this, again, it's a little hard for me to fully account for the scope of his claim, except just to take him at his word. And he really seems to think that, yeah, that he can solve factional conflict and it will lead to this, enduring peace, which I think amounts to a dismissal of the classical position on factional conflict as well.
Yeah, I also agree entirely with your observation that, in a way, that was my point, that Aristotle doesn't discuss it because that was not the problem that he was facing it. But I still wanted to put it in that broad context. You said that there's something wrong with the treatment of factional conflict that doesn't examine this the entire variety of factional conflicts. So, and I would also add, of course, the nature of the factional conflict that is based on religion makes it necessary to take an entirely different approach. So whatever the problems that the modern attempt had, I think it's justified because they're dealing with a new situation, and that the old political science could not, as far as I could see, did not address it. So maybe there would be someone more inventive could use their insight to try to address it, but it certainly did not address it. And one last thought. This goes, but the difference between Hobbes and Locke. It seems to me in Locke you find much less hope in solving a problem for good than you find in Hobbes. There's always, for instance, he gives it an account of government in the last chapter of the book called The Solution of Government. The governments fall to pieces. He's also very emphatic that there will be no world state, for instance. There's no promise of peace. You could say it's less ambitious than other versions of liberalism, but you could also say, and I would say, it's more sober than the other versions.
And I want to add one more thing in response to your question, and that is something that I allude to a little bit in the beginning part of my talk, and I thought about making it bigger, but some things have to, many things have to be omitted, as you know. With regard to the factional conflict that the ancients witnessed, it's an economic conflict. It's between rich, poor, two classes, big divide between the classes, by and large. I do think that a major component of this liberal project goes in line with some things you were talking about last night that arose alongside, and it can be a little bit hard to separate out from liberalism, and that is the prospect of economic growth and development, the new science, new innovations. Liberalism is part of that package, that modern package that's on the rise. And my idea here is that maybe they thought that the old sort of factional conflicts could be greatly reduced if the whole tide rises, so that the majority who for eons have been just shut out and impoverished begin to feel just a hope and growth and prospect of prosperity. That whole ancient reason for factional conflict will be more or less taken care of. So there's that also sort of optimism of just kind of endless economic growth and development going forward, I suspect is part of the design.
I have another. Can I go? Okay. I have another question for Nasser about Aristotle and Locke. I'll start by putting the question this way. You said, or your argument is that Locke restores politics. Is that a claim that you think Aristotle would agree with, or not? And I ask the question partly with this thought in mind. You say that Locke does that partly by narrowing the civil interests or the political interests, what politics is about. It seems to me he does so in such a way that politics becomes a lot like what Lycophron says politics is, and Aristotle is critical of, and I think it's somewhere in book 3 of the Politics, and that would lead me to think that Aristotle
Can you
makes.
say what statement of Lycophron?
Yeah, I think the definition has to do kind of sort of contractual politics for the sake of avoiding, for the sake of safety. That's what I take to be what I recall. It seems to me possible Aristotle might have said, well, under these new circumstances, this is the best we can do, but it doesn't amount to a restoration of politics, because something that's essential, maybe even the most important part of politics, has had to be excluded from politics. And so maybe there's an improvement upon the political situation, but it's not quite a restoration of politics. So, and then if your claim is that Locke does restore politics, and your view is that Aristotle wouldn't agree with that, do you have a disagreement with Aristotle about what is essential about politics?
That's a very helpful question. There are many sides to Aristotle's understanding, and you're absolutely right that there's one point where there's a kind of disagreement between Locke and Aristotle, and that has to do with the end of the unity. It's hard for me to know how Aristotle would respond to Locke, because he would have to know the whole situation. But I think it's a plausible inference that from that strict Aristotelian perspective, there's a kind of, in this respect, Locke's politics would be less political. But in other respects, those that I emphasized, I think Aristotle would agree that despotism is not a form of politics, and Locke did destroy that despotism. Aristotle would agree that an aspect of politics is people using their reason, deliberating about it. That's in line. So maybe I would say that Locke restores much of what Aristotle regards as politics. But one final thought, that it's true, I mean, that for Locke, he said the chief end of government is property. But property has a very wide range. And in the passage that I quoted from the fifth chapter about the wise and godlike prince, Locke makes it clear that one of the things that government does is that it attends to character, encouragement of honest industry. That's a matter of character, and so so if in a way, Locke has a very different understanding of what nobility is. This is a point that Strauss makes in his essay on Locke, that industriousness becomes a mark of human nobility. And so if you take that into account, that it's even more political.
Hi, Jenna Story, Furman University. I had a question about how seriously Hobbes takes his own stated ambition to solve the problem of politics. And this is just something I've wondered about for a long time. A small question of interpretation first. When he states the line about geometry that you mentioned, he must, I wonder how to square that, as it were, with the fact that one of the fiercest controversies he got into over the course of his lifetime was about squaring the circle, right? I mean, that was a really difficult fight for him, which I can't remember the exact consequences of it, but certainly exclusion from professional life. And I think it got worse. I'm drawing on own memory, but I've always wondered how to read that line. I thought he must be saying it with his usual irony. So that's my smaller question, somewhat linked to my larger question, which is whether or not he took his own ambitions seriously there, he states them in that kind of fanatical way, as you said. He's fighting against fanatics, and I'm wondering if you think he thought, or whatever you think about this question, whether when you're fighting against fanatics, do you need to use fanatical language, as you're suggesting that Hobbes did, or does his lack of influence show that Locke's less fanatical approach is more efficacious, or did we need Hobbes to pave the way for Locke? I'm wondering about this because it's obviously a question we're debating today.
On the first interpretive question, I'm inclined to read, especially in the broader context of that quotation where he's comparing the success of Euclid in establishing the science as compared to what the ancients did in moral science, where there's just endless factions and disagreement and so forth. And I don't know, maybe there's mathematics has reached a stage, there may be factions of modern geometry. I honestly don't know, but I feel pretty confident in Hobbes' day. There was the basics of geometry. It was pretty clear. It could be agreement once you've defined the line and so forth. It just follows, and everyone can see it, and it's not controversial because you can just see it. That's my sense of what he hoped to do with clear definitions based on incontrovertible first principles of human action. I think he does. I mean, my interpretation, he does mean that somewhat seriously. The rhetorical, as to the rhetorical approach, I'm not sure. I don't think I have I'd have to think about that more. Yeah, it's possible.
Time, I think, for one more question.
For Judd also, I really enjoyed, I enjoyed all the papers, and we have some disagreements about Hobbes, but I wanted to leave those alone and offer what I hope are two friendly amendments to things that you said that I actually do agree very strongly with. One is, I think you're absolutely right to focus on the influence of Thucydides and the very specific influence. My suggestion is that particularly when you're talking about Thucydides' influence on his views of the state of nature, I think the key passage is actually in the Archaeology, in Book 1, where actually if you look at it, you can see that, so this is pre-civil Greece, right, where he's giving you this kind of very grim account of, that in those days there was no, piracy was considered acceptable because there was no stigma attached to it, there was no industry because the fruits thereof were uncertain. That's his translation that's his own translation in 1629.
Yeah.
Those are exactly the same words in chapter 13 of Leviathan, right? And so he's actually paraphrasing in the crucial description of the state of nature in chapter 13, his own translation in Thucydides in book 1. So actually, if you're interested in that, I think look at it. The other thing that I really take very seriously, as you're told, that one of the extraordinary things about Hobbes is the idea of an immortal commonwealth, right? That if you follow the principles, you're going to have an immortal commonwealth. I don't think it's quite so new, because Hobbes here is, so you're quite right that he loathes Aristotle. The one ancient philosopher that he actually has nice things about is Plato. He's, at this point, following in a tradition of people not so much reading the Republic, but reading the laws, which is much more friendly to the idea that this arrangement, if the laws are right, might just keep on going. And so More's Utopia is supposed to be an immortal commonwealth. And my colleague Richard Tuck has written about the degree to which you could see Leviathan as part of this sort of utopian story. And I think there's something to that. But I think it raises another point which might help you to think about the question that Devin asked about why. Why did he think, what made him have this extraordinary thought about, as it were, solving the problems once and for all. And that is something that really does distinguish him very sharply from Aristotle, puts him closer to Plato and other determinists in his own sort of period, and that is his acceptance of the idea that what causes people to do wrong is false belief. So he has, this is one area of sort of Platonism that he completely accepts, that no one knowingly does wrong. So he has no room in his theory for, Aristotelian sort of akrasia or sin, even in the traditions, knowing willfully doing a wrong act. So I think the idea that he has that you could simply solve all of this by teaching the correct principles and giving everyone proper information connects to your point about the universities and why it was so important for all of this to be taught, and explains what would otherwise be quite mysterious. That is, and not just the idea that people only do wrong so that an immortal commonwealth is possible if you teach everyone correct beliefs, but also makes sense of his equally very sharp rejection of retributivism, right, of any kind, because punishment, as for the sake of no good end, right, or vengeance, or whatever, has to drop out once you have the right kind of anthropology. So I think that's really important, and I think it also distinguishes him massively from the other people we've been talking about today.
Okay, although I think for Plato you have to put that alongside Socrates, the Platonic Socrates' repeated insistence that he doesn't know, and the failure to find others who do know the truth about these things, whereas Hobbes wants it to be something that's very plain and teachable, and not nearly as difficult as Plato makes it seem it is to come to the truth about these matters. So, yeah.
We should discuss that.
Okay.
Well, that concludes this session. Please join me in thanking our panelists.